Let's start now by talking a bit about globalization. What does it really mean? Well, and what does it entail?
I think a very simple definition would be that what it really means is that people have the right to move vast sums of money across international borders, but the same doesn't apply to labor or human beings or anything, you know. And what the result of it has been, let's say, in a country like India, the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, with the privatization of everything: electricity, water, mountains, rivers, retail sector, mining, all of that. Telecommunications. So we today have a situation in which you have something like 800 million people living on less than $0.50 a day, and 100 people own the wealth equivalent to 25% of the GDP. And you have something like 49% of the children are malnutritioned. You have 250,000 farmers who've committed suicide because they're getting caught in debt, when the input costs of their cash crops far exceed what they are being able to sell it at. And you have a huge environmental crisis. And yet, increasingly, you're in a situation where everything is being privatized. Now, just yesterday, they voted for, Walmart and all these big malls to come in. And the same thing has happened in the countryside with the sort of corporatization of agriculture, mining, all of this massive displacement, a lot of resistance, a lot of unrest. I mean, these are the things that I've been writing about,
Right.
And I think what happens is that in a country like India, this thing has been, the government has just kneeled down in front of the United States, the World Bank, the IMF, and so it's galloping at an incredible speed, and often you have so many different kinds of conflict. I mean, huge conflict has to do with this in the mainland India, whereas in places like Kashmir and Manipur and so on, as I've said, it has to do with self-determination and so on. And both these kinds of uprisings don't fully understand each other. This is a problem,
Right. They say, doesn't this globalization aim at banishing a people's culture and peculiarities in a sense of moving into a unilateral policy?
Absolutely. I mean, the market needs people who are sort of flattened. They need people to want the same things, to desire the same things, to have the same definition of happiness.
Did it succeed in India?
No, not yet, but the speed of the ferocity and the speed of the attack is huge. So just yesterday, for example, one of the last holdouts was, where they were not allowing foreign direct investment in the retail sector. Now they've allowed that. So the entire machinery of protecting a market is gone. So the smallest farmer in India will be competing with corporate farmers. All the small shops and businesses will be shut because they'll be competing with Walmart and things like that. So it's really a very, very frightening situation.
But from working on the ground, how can the tide of globalization be stood? How can you stand in the face of this tide?
Well, look...
Is it easy to educate the people and to let them know the dire consequences of this globalization?
Some things not, and some things the people know better than the people sitting in cities, So, in fact, one of the great things about India is that people on the ground, especially in the countryside, have been standing up to these major corporations for since 2004. So you have a situation where the poorest people in the world are standing up and fighting the richest corporations, and sometimes winning, So people in India, a lot of people know what's happening. But it's become a police state. So like in the states of central India where they are mining in the forests, you have hundreds of thousands of paramilitary, trying to make people evacuate their villages and so on. So you have all these laws which used to only be in Kashmir and Manipur now being brought into the central mainland.
Is it easy for you, Arundhati, with this police state to get your ideas through?
I'm not the point of this, The point is that there are a lot of very powerful middle-class intellectuals, very powerful NGOs, very powerfully funded people who are making another version of India in which all this, which I see as a very structural problem, is just seen as an aberration. Like, oh, this is a very big, generous, confused country and we are trying to get it right, but sometimes things go wrong. Whereas I see it as a much more frightening, purposeful, venture in which people are just being, the wealth is being concentrated in fewer hands, the business is being concentrated in fewer corporations,
the giant enterprises.
The media is being controlled by this big business. The big business is funding everything. It's funding the government, it's funding the opposition, it's buying the courts, it owns the media, it's funding higher education, it has law schools, and it's funding artists, and it's funding literature festivals. Everything is being funded by these companies. And everybody is playing that game. And
so they can move the people in the track that they wish. Now, India had a history of support of the Palestinian struggle and cause. At the same time, back in the 1990s, they had bilateral ties with Israel. How can we understand this paradox? How can they support the Palestinians and have ties with Israel?
Well, I don't think that they support the Palestinians anymore. I mean, formally, the Indian government continues to say that it sees itself as the natural ally of US and Israel. So pre the 1990s, when India was aligned with the Soviet Union, and it was a great friend of the Palestinians. But after
the fall of the Soviet
Union, after the dismantling of the protections of the Indian market, when this current Prime Minister Manmohan Singh became Finance Minister, and he dismantled protection for labor, he opened the markets, he aligned himself completely with the IMF, with the US, with Israel. So now it's not just a natural ally, but now they are sharing intelligence, they are doing joint military training.
Exercises.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as Pakistan becomes more and more conflicted, a more and more difficult state, the United States is going to be stepping back into India and hoping that it can make bases here. I think this is what the future is, and certainly very keen that India sends troops to Afghanistan when it withdraws, which will be very difficult for any Indian government to sell to the people, but certainly this is on the agenda, and that whole thing fits in with this ghettoization of Indian Muslims and pushing them further and further into a corner.
Do you think that it is more important to fight on the ground, Arundhati?
Well, you see, unless there's a fight on the ground, everything else becomes meaningless, The other aspects come in later. We can, of course, talk about what we mean by fight, but certainly in India, people on the ground are holding their ground, fighting. In Kashmir they're fighting. But the problem is that doesn't include so many other kinds of dispossession in India. There are people who don't have any ground. Then where do they fight? The whole caste system, the whole dispossession of the so-called untouchables,
Even the women.
And the women. So you know, I mean, the women, for example, last year, 2 years ago, I'd gone into the forest where there's a guerrilla war going on, and 45-50% of the soldiers on the ground are women, right? So, but they have ground, but you know, then there's no such thing as the Indian woman, right? There's so many, I mean, starting from people like myself to people who are totally dispossessed, who are being forced to commit female feticide, you know, all of that. I mean, it's a very vast canvas what we mean by women and the fights that they are putting up. And in fact, in the women's movement, one of the greatest problems is the NGOization of it. You know, these kind of foreign-funded NGOs that are set up, where they are encouraged to discuss everything except economic imperialism, you know. So you become people who are just dealing with certain issues of gender, but has nothing to do with
You have too many red lines in India, it seems.
Red lines?
Yes.
Meaning?
Like, for example, you cannot approach this issue, and you cannot approach, for example, the Kashmir issue. You cannot approach the economic imperialism. You cannot...
No, the Kashmir issue is a red line, that's for sure. But everything else, you know, everybody's discussing it, I mean, fighting, talking. It's just that juggernaut keeps moving. But Kashmir is a red line. I mean, I would say there's a 100% consensus in the Indian mainland on Kashmir, almost, you know. It's just like 2 or 3 people who will say anything, because you also face physical violence, if you say it, not just violence from the state.
Has this happened to you?
Yes, of course it's happened to me, and continues to happen. There are organizations who say that if whenever she appears to speak about anything, wherever she appears, we go and break it up, and they do try.
So, novelist and political essayist and activist, Ms. Arundhati Roy, thanks a million for this unique interview.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Thank you, my dear. إذن لقاء جديد في الأسبوع